Well, welcome to Generally Terrible, the worst U.S. generals of all time, a Virginia War Memorial live stream learning from the home front. Since 1956, the Virginia War Memorial has been dedicated to the mission of honoring veterans, preserving history, educating youth, and inspiring patriotism in all. We hope you'll enjoy today's presentation and continue your interest and support of the Virginia War Memorial's educational programs. President Abraham Lincoln once said, "I can make more generals, but horses cost money." Today, Virginia War Memorial Director Dr. Clay Mountcastle will discuss his list of the worst military leaders in American history. If you have a question during today's presentation, please feel free to submit your question using the chat feature throughout the presentation. They will be answered at the conclusion of the program. And now let us join Dr. Clay Mountcastle.
All right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Jim. I always appreciate Jim's silky smooth introduction that he does for our programs. Jim is our Director of Education. We appreciate his service as the voice of the Virginia War Memorial. I'm Clay. I'm the director here at the Virginia War Memorial. And thank you all for joining us for this program, in which we wanted to try something just a little different, something perhaps not as serious as some of our previous live stream programs, yet still informative and a bit fun. You know, we teach military history at the Memorial. We offer military history resources to educators and, tour groups and student groups and all those. And more often than not, we talk about service and leadership. And a lot of times we talk about those military leaders that have done great things for the country and great things for the Commonwealth of Virginia. Well, today I thought it might be kind of fun to focus on those leaders, those military leaders that have not done great things for the country and quite instead have ended up on the bad side of history. And perhaps the generals that you either heard of because they were so bad, or some generals that you perhaps never heard of because history has skipped over them completely because of their poor performance when their leadership was on the line. So today I'm going to offer my 10 worst generals in American military history. Yes, I did not travel outside the scope of American history because I just thought it would be a little easier to keep it within the confines of our own nation's history. I'm not all that familiar with the history of Spanish generals or Peruvian generals or anything like that. So we're going to stick to the American military experience. And you might ask yourself, okay, so how does Mountcastle do this, delineation? How does Mountcastle decide who the 10 worst generals in American history were? Well, for me, there were a few of them that I, have always considered really bad. And, I've taught military history in a number of settings to Army officers, to cadets, to civilians, and more often than not, every now and then you discuss a general that was just bad, flat out bad, and for different reasons. But for this particular list, I really looked at what I thought a bad general was made of. What are the ingredients that really lead up to making a bad general? What's the recipe for that? And what I was able to come up with were, let's see. Okay, there we are. And a few things: dithering, hiding, running, blaming, and just fell off the slide there, losing. Losing is up there as well. That these different things, these different verbs are kind of a common thread that run through my list of what makes a really bad general. When in that leadership position, they did something along the lines of dithering, hiding, running, blaming, and losing. And that's where we get to the list. So without further ado, I'm going to run down my list, starting with the 10th worst and taking it all the way down to the very worst general in American history. Now, you'll see that it does not stick strictly to the U.S. Army. I tried to be a little bit joint in this effort and spread the love or the disappointment to other branches of the military as best I could. But sometimes you got to point the finger where it lies. And so you will see this list is heavily populated with U.S. Army personnel. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pick it up with the 10th worst. And here we have General Jay Mckelvey. General Jay Mckelvey from World War II, most notably from World War II, but that wasn't the full extent of his service. He was a World War I veteran. He served at the St. Mihiel offensive during World War I. He was an artillery officer by training. And during the interwar period, he did okay, did decently in his career, his education, moving up in rank along the way. And so when World War II arrived, he was a well thought of artillery commander. He commanded division artillery units at the beginning of World War II. But what Jay Mckelvey would become most known for was his performance during the Normandy invasion, or what we most famously refer to as D-Day. He was placed in command of the 90th Infantry Division before the invasion of Normandy, their motto being the tough hombres, which is a little ironic because the reason Jay Mckelvey is on this list is he did not live up to that moniker of tough hombre. When the 90th Infantry Division arrived at Normandy, it was D+1. So the initial wave of the attacks onto Utah Beach and other locations had happened the day before. So the beachhead had already been seized. The Allied troops had made their way inland a bit, but the fighting was still pretty heavy, just a few miles inland, fighting within the hedgerows, trying to beat back the German army, who was putting up a very tough defense while they were retreating, withdrawing, and trying to push the Allies back into the English Channel. So, there was some decent fighting still going on, and the 90th Division was coming in to pass through the lines of units like the 82nd and others that had jumped in the early stages of Normandy and try and continue to push that fight and push the Germans further back into France. But the problem was that while a lot of these other divisions associated with the D-Day invasion, like the 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st, those types of units, the 90th Infantry Division struggled mightily during the initial phases of the Normandy invasion and its arrival. And most of that was just chalked up to a complete feeling of disorganization and complete lack of leadership. And when you are the division commander of the division that is stalled and not doing very well, that becomes your problem. And things were so bad within the first couple of days that the 90th was in position trying to, make advance and push the Germans back, that the corps commander went looking for his 90th Division commander and couldn't find him, couldn't find any semblance of what was going on and how things were being done with the 90th. And there's a great quote that I'm going to use here from a book that journalist and historian Tom Ricks put out recently called The Generals. And it lists the reaction of General McKelvey's assistant division commander, a guy named Brigadier General Hangin Sam Williams, who went looking for McKelvey as well, trying to figure out what exactly was going on with the 90th and why weren't they being able to get things done. He could not find his commander. And then ultimately he found General McKelvey hiding in a ditch somewhere in the hedgerows. And when he found him there, his assistant, General McKelvey's assistant, General Williams, said this, quote, "God damn it, General. You can't lead this division hiding in that goddamn hole. Go back to the CP, get the hell out of that hole and go to your vehicle, walk to it, or you'll have this goddamn division waiting in the English Channel." So it's a pretty bad day when not only is your boss looking for you and can't find you, but your subordinate comes and finds you and then has to give you a butt chewing in order to get, anything done. So that was kind of the low light of Jay Mckelvey's performance at Normandy. He was relieved of command by the corps commander soon thereafter. And that pretty much ended his career in command. However, he stayed on and did some other positions throughout the fight through Germany and kind of, still contributed in his own way. So he did some good things. That's probably why he's at the top of this list and not at the bottom, number 10. So not a great performance on Normandy, and some good reasons why Captain William Depew, who would go on to become the first commander of the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command, wrote about being in the 90th Infantry Division during D-Day, and he referred to his own division as the 90th was a killing machine of its own men. So not a good thing for Jay Mckelvey, and that's why he ends up being number 10 worst. All right. Next, number 9, that brings us to Charles Willoughby. Willoughby himself was also not just a veteran of World War II, but even fought in World War I, but he would become most notorious for his performance during the Korean War. But he was actually born in Germany to German parents. His name was Adolf Weidenbach. He was born early on just around the turn of the century. And they moved to the United States. He joined the U.S. military. He served with the U.S. Expeditionary Force in World War I. And then he served as a staff officer in World War II, a military intelligence officer. And he worked for General Douglas MacArthur in World War II. So he became one of MacArthur's boys. MacArthur was a big fan of Willoughby, even though at times MacArthur admitted that Willoughby was not the greatest intelligence officer out there, but he liked his loyalty. And Willoughby was certainly loyal to Douglas MacArthur. So loyal, in fact, that when the time came in 1950 and MacArthur was commanding UN forces in Korea, trying to beat back the invasion of South Korea from the communist North Koreans, and General MacArthur was very high on the idea of pushing the offensive into North Korea all the way up to the Yalu River and pressing the fight in hopes of delivering a knockout blow to North Korea. When Willoughby was acting as his primary military intelligence officer during this assignment, he was accused and has continued to be accused over the course of history of not only hiding intelligence, but distorting intelligence, making up intelligence, all for the purpose of allowing MacArthur to continue on with his drive up north to the Yalu River. The problem was there was intelligence suggesting that there was a huge massing of Chinese soldiers on the Yalu River. And that was not going to be a good thing. It proved not to be a good thing because there was a counterattack. China became involved, jumped into the war, and ended up with a disastrous retreat from the Yalu River. That was very costly for the UN, particularly American soldiers and Marines. So historians have often said, well, if Willoughby had, not chosen to let his loyalty cloud his true duties, and that was to report the intelligence accurately, because clearly it seems like a lot of people knew that there were a lot of Chinese soldiers waiting up there on the Yalu River to conduct a counterattack. But Willoughby was so in line with what MacArthur wanted to do that he's, probably felt he was doing right by his commander and making the intelligence look so that it was a good idea to continue this offensive up to the north in 1950. He also wrote a 1,000-page butt-kissing biography of MacArthur, of his personal hero after the war. And then, interestingly enough, Willoughby was a huge anti-communist. So, nothing wrong with that. Clearly, especially at that time frame. However, he was at times referred to as a bit of a fascist, which I don't know if we can really hold that to him. And he wasn't a card-carrying member, perhaps, but even MacArthur referred to him as, quote, his little fascist. That's not necessarily a pet name that I would be proud of. But after the war, he went on to become an advisor and a lobbyist for the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco, interestingly enough. So, a bit of an interesting past. So certainly when we think about Charles Willoughby today, he does not shine as one of our best intelligence officers. And certainly when you're looking at how difficult things became in Korea, particularly in that campaign in Northern Korea, and that resulted in Chosin Reservoir and entrapment and then a need to break out. Certainly if Willoughby had done some things differently, perhaps things would have happened differently. So that's why Charles Willoughby ends up at number 9. All right. And that brings us to Howland Jake Smith, General Jacob Smith, short, bald, beady-eyed. I'm not going to hold the baldness against him, certainly. But Jacob Smith is notorious, and you don't get assigned a lot of these nicknames like Howland Wilderness Smith or Howland Jake Smith without being a bit notorious. He was a commander of U.S. troops on the island of Samar in the Philippines during the late stages of the Philippine War, 1901, 1902, as the Philippine Islands were trying to be pacified, and President Teddy Roosevelt was trying to, or excuse me, not Teddy Roosevelt, but they were trying to pacify the Philippine Islands, and Jacob Smith was in command of troops on the island of Samar. The let me make sure I get this right, Balangia Massacre occurred in 1902, where a number of American soldiers were taken by surprise by Philippine villagers and some organized guerrilla forces that were organized against the American occupation. And a number of them were killed during this massacre, and that made Jacob Smith furious, perhaps, not surprisingly, or we can't blame him for being furious about this. What the problem is his reaction to this massacre was to get to return violence and brutality with even more violence and brutality. He ordered his subordinates to go on a campaign in which, and there's a quote there, he wanted no prisoners. He wanted them to kill and burn, and the more that they would kill and burn, the better it would please him. And he wanted all persons killed who were capable of bearing arms against hostilities. And when a subordinate officer asked him for clarification as to, who are we talking about and what age are we talking about, Smith replied to him, and this would come up later in a court martial. He said, "I want you to kill everyone over the age of 10. And what resulted was a brutal campaign, an act of punitive war, a vengeful act on the island of Samar, scorched earth policy, carrying out Smith's orders. Now, the orders themselves wouldn't even come to light until much later, when one of his subordinates, a Major Littleton Waller, was put on court martial for some of the atrocities carried out on Samar. And Waller began to offer the defense, perhaps not surprisingly, hey, I was doing what I was instructed to do by my commander, Jacob Smith. Now, perhaps the reason that Smith is on this list is not just the punitive measure that really exceeded what most, even his peers at the time, his leadership, and historians at the time, or historians now, have looked back and said was a justifiable measure or rational measure. Not only was his order crossing the line, but when he was called to the stand as a bit of a defense witness for Waller, Smith got up there and denied that he ever gave him, I didn't say for him to do all these terrible things. He went out on his own and did it. So not only did he cross the line and give these terrible, harsh orders, then he came back and threw Waller under the bus. And that's one of those things that gets you on this list, is when you throw your own people on the bus trying to cover your own butt once it's sitting in a witness chair in a court martial afterwards. But the problem was Waller had receipts, as they say. He produced handwritten orders from Smith detailing the brutal measures that Smith wanted him to do. So Smith himself would be the subject of a court martial. However, they wouldn't give him the harshest punishment. It effectively ended his military career. And yet he enjoyed a little bit of celebrity when he returned home to the United States, hence the nicknames Howland Jake, go get him, that kind of stuff. Folks in his hometown didn't seem to think he was too bad of a guy. But particularly for trying to throw Waller under the bus, he ends up at number 8. All right, Richmond K. Turner, Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner from World War II. There's two things that really put the Admiral on this list. First is there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of controversy about his performance leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was in a position of intelligence, knowing the intelligence leading up to Pearl Harbor, a bit of a command position, working specifically for Admiral Kimmel there, who is commanding the naval forces at Pearl Harbor on the eve of the attack on December 7th, 1941. And apparently, Richmond Turner had indications that a Japanese attack was imminent, and that there were a lot of dots connecting, suggesting that, you know, it's a good chance. Not that it might happen someday or it could happen someday, but there were indications that something was going to happen and happen soon. And Richmond K. Turner did not inform Admiral Kimmel of what he knew. Now, historians have tried to know exactly what did he know and when did he know it. But there seems to be a consensus that Turner intentionally did not tell Kimmel about some things that he knew, and therefore Kimmel did not make some defensive adjustments or even put, you know, certain forces on alert or decide to move some of the fleet out into the Pacific to avoid damage during an attack. And that had Turner told Kimmel what he knew at the time, then Kimmel may have been able to better prepare Pearl Harbor for an attack. So there's that. There's the Pearl Harbor issue, but the real issue, he's on this list, and the real issue, he has a bit of a black spot on his history, was during the Battle of Savo Island, during the Guadalcanal campaign in August of 1942. Turner was in command of naval forces there around Savo Island. It was a sea clash with Japanese Navy and Japanese Air Forces. And it ended up being a really bad defeat for the American Navy, a huge loss of both ships and sailors within a very short period of time, 32 minutes. Within 32 minutes, 4 Allied cruisers were lost completely, and 4 destroyers were heavily damaged. So within the matter of half an hour, the fleet sustained significant damage, and also over 1,000 Allied soldiers were killed. Just think about that. And there was also a good amount of friendly fire that occurred during those 32 minutes. During committees looking at the action and what happened, it was determined that, you know, there wasn't much organization, there wasn't much preparation, that Turner didn't have his fleet positioned in the proper position to deal with an attack when it came into place. And then when the time came, it generally felt that nobody knew really what to do, that they weren't trained properly, or they didn't use the techniques or the responses that they were trained to do when the attack occurred. Once again, when Turner was, placed in a position of inquiry for this, he chalked it up to the members, his peers and his subordinates, quote, having a confidence without readiness, that they were overconfident. He wasn't. He knew the real deal. He knew what the Japanese Navy was capable of, but unfortunately, according to Turner, his peers and his sailors simply didn't get it, that they were a real threat. And now, they found out. Again, this is a classic case of the person at the top deflecting criticism down to those beneath him or around him, and not accepting responsibility. Sometimes when you're the person in charge of a unit that suffers such significant defeat and casualties in such a short time, you should probably own it and not try and blame others for not having a confidence or having too much confidence without readiness. He also accused them of having a lethargy of mind, whatever that means. It kind of sounds a bit like a superiority complex. But Richmond Turner would go on to continue to serve. I mean, the results from Savo weren't great for him. He did change positions, but he continued to serve. And ultimately, he was not held into too bad account of regard, because ultimately they named a ship after him. So there it is, the USS Richmond K. Turner. Served for a number of years. It was eventually sunk as a target during target practice, but it had a long service in the Navy. So I guess you can't be that bad if you have a ship named after you, although having a ship named after him does not get him off of this list. He lands at number 7, and there he shall remain. All right, now sticking with the Navy, and this one is a little different, okay? This one is not just one individual, but number 6 is a group of individuals. These are admirals behaving badly. And we've heard recently about generals behaving badly and admirals behaving badly. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon these days to read an article or hear a news report about the next general or admiral that has been relieved from their position for lack of confidence in their ability to conduct themselves appropriately. Oftentimes it involves inappropriate relationships, somebody that they're involved with that they shouldn't be doing or saying something that they shouldn't do. This number 6 pertains to a large number of senior Navy officers of the U.S. 7th Fleet that were seduced by the charms of Fat Leonard. Fat Leonard was this Malaysian contractor business guy who used a various number of techniques to schmooze, to grease the skids with commanders within the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet during the years of 2006 to 2013. It involved money, bribes, it involved parties, alcohol, free travel expenses. It involved prostitutes. He apparently had a troop of prostitutes referred to as the Thai SEAL Team Elite. This is all from the items coming out of these articles. I'm not naming specific military or naval leaders by name. A number of them are still out there. I don't think any of them that were truly involved in this are still on active duty. There was an extensive investigation that continues to this day, I believe. And every so often you'll hear about yet another senior Navy officer that has been connected to the Fat Leonard scandal and has been relieved of their command. But it is a sad commentary on just how susceptible a lot of these senior officers were to a very simple, the temptations of money and exotic dancers and a good time. And it was not limited to just a few individuals, unfortunately. It went on for years, and the investigation has gone on for years, and it has ended the careers of a number of high-ranking naval officers. So I think I was looking around the internet for details on this. 60 admirals, 60, not 6, not 16, 60 different U.S. Navy admirals have been under investigation in connection to the Fat Leonard scandal. So, and they, apparently affectionately referred to themselves as the Wolf Pack before the crap hit the fan. It was kind of like a little joke or something like that. Well, all I can say is shame on the Wolf Pack. You should know better. You shouldn't be out there, making morally and illegal decisions with your command and schmoozing it up with a Malaysian, scam artist trying to make a buck off the Navy, and compromising your integrity and your position, your leadership. So shame on you, Wolfpack. You know who you are. We don't need to name names, and you arrive at number 6 on here. So hopefully the Wolfpack doesn't grow any larger. It's hopefully we've gotten to the end of the list of senior Navy commanders that have been taken down by Fat Leonard and his scandal. But we'll see. I mean, if you're interested, you can always go online, Google Fat Leonard, and you can get the names yourself. I won't give them to you. All right, now halfway through, number 5. Here we are. Yes, Lloyd Friedan, General Lloyd Friedan. Sometimes you might say, well, he had the misfortune of being in command of U.S. troops during their initial, maybe worst defeat during World War II at Kasserine Pass. But if you really dig into it, Lloyd Friedan was asking to be on this list because he was the commander of U.S. Second Corps in Tunisia in 1943, Operation Torch, North Africa, that area. Not surprisingly, he was a not a USMA graduate. He was admitted to the United States Military Academy. He was kicked out of the United States Military Academy. He was allowed back into the U.S. Military Academy, and then he dropped out of the U.S. Military Academy. So a bit of a checkered past as a young military leader or getting into the military. But ultimately, he rises to the level of a Corps commander, U.S. Second Corps in Northern Africa. And what then happened once, his troops, along with some British allies, were trying to fend off the German forces there in North Africa, is General Lloyd Friedan displayed leadership from the rear in perhaps the best way or most effective way that anybody has ever demonstrated that idea. I'm not saying that it is effective or best. I'm saying he demonstrated leadership from the rear in perhaps the most effective way. And what he did was he went to immense pains to set up his headquarters, his personal headquarters, 70 miles from the front. Again, that's not 7, that's not 17, that's 70 miles from the front. He dug bunkers into the side of a cliff, had extensive anti-air artillery placed all around his headquarters. Meanwhile, 70 miles away, his Corps troops are trying to fight it out with the Germans, and they're having a hard time being in the right position, getting the support they need, having mutually supportive positions, all because the Corps commander is still digging in 70 miles behind them, and he refused to go to the front. A number of people suggested, General, you probably should go up front there and visit your troops and see the situation. And he would not do so. He would look at maps and he would give orders over the radio in hopes that people 70 miles away would get his gist and get it right. General Eisenhower visited his troops positions up front. General Bradley visited Friedan's troops up to the front, and yet the Corps commander himself wouldn't go to the front. So eventually, Eisenhower and Bradley decided we need a general that's not going to hide in the rear. His troops definitely were not fond of him after a while. His subordinate commanders were more than happy to report to other generals just how bad General Friedan's leadership from the rear was, and it wasn't helping. They referred to his headquarters way back there as Lloyd's last resort. So just not a good performance. And when I served some time in the military, and people always say you got to lead from the front, you can't lead from the rear. Well, Lloyd Friedan found out the hard way that leadership from the rear wasn't a good thing. So, luckily the Second Corps was able to rebound from loss at Kasserine Pass and go on to continue to fight in the European theater and with new, more effective commanders. So there it is. You're not going to find too many history books that smile very brightly on General Friedan. Leadership from the rear. All right. Number 4. General Gideon Pillow. Going back to the Civil War, folks. Gideon Pillow was a Confederate officer from Tennessee. Now, he did not begin military service in the Civil War. He began during the Mexican War, where he served. He fought in a number of campaigns. He was actually wounded at Chapultepec. So one might think that, wow, okay, he's doing some good things. The problem was, he had a knack for taking credit, and he had a knack for, trying to make himself sound better and more important than he really was. And he did so much of that he managed to tick off not only General Winfield Scott, but Zachary Taylor. The two major American commanders in Mexico both hated Gideon Pillow for some reason. There's a great political cartoon from the time of General Winfield Scott poking the truth sword into Pillow's self-inflating pillow, blowing himself up. But you also notice on that small cartoon, if you can see it, it says Polk's patent. The reason Gideon Pillow was able to survive a court-martial initiated by Winfield Scott for his insubordination and his self-promotion was because Gideon Pillow was President James K. Polk's law partner from a previous in previous years. So he was his law buddy. And therefore, being friends with the president's not a bad thing. And so he was able to avoid any serious repercussions on him. And that allowed him that when the Civil War rolled around, he was appointed as a commander for a volunteer corps from Tennessee. And he eventually ended up at Fort Donelson during the campaign in the West, Fort Donelson, 1862. And as you probably know, Fort Donelson surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. Perhaps maybe where, people talk about U.S. Grant, unconditional surrender Grant, and his capturing of Fort Donelson. Well, Pillow was a commander there at Fort Donelson. And it's kind of interesting to see who was truly in charge, because Pillow didn't begin in charge, but he was handed command of Fort Pillow right before it fell or surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. And then Pillow didn't want that hot potato, so he threw it to General Buckner, Simon Bolivar Buckner, and said, "Here, you take it." There was a chance while Pillow was in command there at Fort Donelson, there was an attack on the siege lines. There was a breakthrough, and there was a chance there for the Confederate forces to exploit that breakthrough and break the siege and get out of there and relieve, or just, get through the siege and move on and live to fight another day. However, once the breakthrough occurred, inexplicably, General Pillow did nothing. He dithered. He sat there for more than a day, and that allowed Grant's troops to, gather themselves, refit themselves, rearm themselves, get reinforcements in there, and reset the siege. So there's the inability to act, the dithering. And then when it was clear that the fort was going to fall and that they were going to surrender, Gideon Pillow did not stand out there and say, "Okay, General Grant, here, I surrender the fort." No, Gideon Pillow jumped in a boat and got himself out of there, leaving his troops behind to be captured by Ulysses S. Grant's army. And Pillow got away crossing the river on a boat. So not only did he dither, but he also ran, and he lost. So that's Gideon Pillow. And there's one more chapter in his inauspicious history. He fought later at the Battle of the Stones River in 1863. And not much unlike General McKelvey, his subordinate or his commander at the time, General John C. Breckinridge, was riding around looking for Pillow. Where is this guy? And John Breckinridge found him hiding behind a tree. And so Pillow had to get dressed down by John C. Breckinridge and say, "Get your butt out from behind a tree and go fight." So, ran, hid, lost, dithered. All those things add up to a good solid number 4 on this list of bad generals. Dudley Saltonstall. This guy, who knows? Maybe this guy deserves to be number 1. I don't know. But Admiral Saltonstall was the naval commander for continental and colonial forces during the Penobscot expedition. You might not be familiar with the Penobscot expedition. Happened up in what is now the coast of Maine. At the time, Maine was not a state, but it occurred in the year 1779 during the American Revolution. The British had captured some ports, small ports along what we'll just call the Maine coastline, Penobscot Bay, and established a very small fort, not very well manned, not a whole lot of British troop presence there. And so Dudley Saltonstall was dispatched from Boston with a large armada of probably, perhaps 2 times the amount of ships and troops that the British had up there on the Maine coast. 44 ships, and over 1,000 American colonial Marines in Saltonstall's armada sent up there to, hey, go capture this small British fort, get rid of this small contingent of British Navy up there and get that port back. Well, Saltonstall arrived in the Penobscot Bay area, And when he got there, he decided that rather than attack the fort and attack the British ships that were guarding the fort, he was going to pull his ships back out of range from the fort and just kind of sail back and forth. There was a large land force commanded by General Lovell, who was supposed to be acting in concert in cooperation with Saltonstall. Well, Lovell maintained that he could not attack the fort, the British fort, until Dudley Saltonstall was able to reduce the naval presence there and also attack the fort. They went back and forth between each other, kind of like a chicken and egg thing. No, you go first and then I go. No, I can go first and you go. And it was really a dysfunctional command relationship. There were conferences of war where they would take a vote, and nobody could seem to get enough votes to decide who was going to act first. But what's clear is Saltonstall knew that he had a superior force, even had intelligence suggesting that the British were just waiting for him to make a move, and then they were going to surrender their ships and abandon, because they thought it was a fight that was clearly going to go the way of Saltonstall's armada, and yet he would not act, he would not attack. And what this did was allow the British to send word to their forces, their General Clinton, located further south, and the British dispatched a kind of a rescue naval fleet to head up there, and Saltonstall did nothing, dithered for about 2 weeks, and allowed the British naval forces, the relief force, to show up. And then he took his armada up the river at Penobscot. Obviously I'm not from the area. And there up the river, rather than put up a hard fight or something, he scuttled all of his fleet and all 44 ships. And then the remaining crew and sailors and militia and all those on those boats then had to walk back to Boston. No food, no nothing, but bitterness and disappointment in their commander, who basically, sailed up there with all the advantage in the world, sailed back and forth, didn't do anything, got chased down the river, decided to destroy and scuttle all of his own ships, and then made all of his people walk all the way back to Boston with no food. So a really, really bad performance. Hopefully nothing is named after Dudley Saltonstall anywhere in New England or anywhere else. So an inauspicious performance, to say the least. No. All right, we're getting close. Number 2. Oh, Horatio Gates. Granny Gates, as he was inaffectionately referred to by a lot of his troops. Now, one could easily say that Horatio Gates should not be number 2. I mean, the guy performed pretty well during the Saratoga campaign in 1777, was the commander of the Continental forces at Saratoga that defeated General John Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, accepted Burgoyne's surrender, captured his army. So certainly during the Saratoga campaign, Horatio Gates was the man. He was the hero of Saratoga. It's what happened later that historians cannot forget nor forgive. Later in the Southern campaign, Horatio Gates found himself in command of the Continental Army in the South. And when it came to the Battle of Camden, he relied heavily on the use of militia. Militia did not perform very well, predictably. And when the militia collapsed pretty quickly, Horatio Gates's will collapsed as well, because reports were that the last thing that a lot of soldiers there fighting at the Battle of Camden saw was the backside of Horatio Gates and his staff as they retreated furiously from the battlefield, leaving his army to stay and fight out the rest, to be captured, killed, whatever. It was a resounding defeat for the Continental Army at Camden. He had been warned. He had been warned by one of his fellow commanders that as he was moving from the northern campaign up in Saratoga and heading down south, he warned him, beware that your northern laurels do not become southern willows. Well, they certainly did. And it wasn't just the fact that Horatio Gates took off and left he left soldiers behind on the battlefield. It's the distance and the speed at which he retreated that has baffled historians. He covered 60 miles that first day. He and his staff retreating like hell to cover 60 miles. And then the following day, he went another 120 miles over the course of a couple days to arrive in Hillsborough. So he went far and fast in retreat. And that has really, it earned him a lot of criticism from some of his peers, Alexander Hamilton being the worst of them. They talked about how Gates, turned and fled, and he just kept going and going and going, and crossed 2 states in order to basically get out of there. Those historians have tried to stand up for Gates a little bit, saying, "Oh, well, he tried. He really tried to rally the militia, and it didn't work." But the fact that he took off so quickly and so far and so fast has really doomed him in the eyes of a lot of historians. So, should Horatio Gates be number 2? Perhaps not, because, maybe his performance at Saratoga should get him up higher on the list. I think it's just because he had the nickname Granny for being kind of old and crotchety. The fact that, he was outshined so much by his replacement, Nathaniel Greene, and that his disrepute, if that's a word, has lived on so well over the years, been very durable, that Horatio Gates, he kind of like, wah, 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 his performance in the South. So we'll leave him at number 2 for that. Perhaps he doesn't deserve it. So sorry, Granny Gates, if that's too high. And that brings us, good people, that brings us to my very worst, my number 1 worst American general. I got to take a drink of water for this one. Now, I will say, I will be a tad bit surprised if a lot of you have heard of this person. So if you're thinking it's one of those well-known people, you might be disappointed. But my number 1 worst American general of all time is a guy named James Ledlie, General James Ledlie of the American Civil War. James Ledlie was not meant to be a good military commander. He was certainly not destined for military greatness. He was an appointee, like many generals in the Civil War were. He was appointed. He did not achieve his rank through merit or anything like that. During the initial phases of the American Civil War, he just served along the coast. He served in coastal positions, places like North Carolina and others, not really doing much of anything, but the fortunes of war and the fact that other people were dying. He rose through the ranks in that way, just out of necessity, need to have a warm body filling certain spots. Eventually, he found himself in command of the 1st Division of the 9th Corps of the Army of the Potomac around Petersburg during the Petersburg campaign. And his corps wasn't terribly well, or his division wasn't terribly well trained, which matched, Ledlie himself. And the problem, or what would eventually turn out to be his downfall as far as his career went, was on the eve of what would become known as the Battle of the Crater, the famous Battle of the Crater there at Petersburg. And if you have not visited Petersburg National Battlefield, please make your way out there and visit the site of the Battle of the Crater. It is absolutely fascinating. On the eve of the Battle of the Crater, his corps commander, the 9th Corps commander, General Ambrose Burnside, was told by the commander of the Army of the Potomac, General George Meade, that the plan that had been formulated for this attack on the Confederate line was going to be changed a little bit. If you're not familiar, there was a really innovative, cool attempt done by a unit of engineers, of miners, actually, from Pennsylvania, that dug a tunnel deep below the Confederate lines there in Petersburg and packed the tunnel filled with powder and charges. And they were going to go ahead and blow up the Confederate defenses there, and then use that as a trigger to assault the Confederate line, and hopefully break through this Confederate line around Petersburg, defensive line around Petersburg. That was the plan. And initially, the plan was that a different division was going to lead the charge. Now, that division contained a number of African-American troops, colored troops, and they had actually trained a bit for this assault and what they were supposed to do when you had this explosion and what was going to be left afterwards. So they had actually planned to be the spearhead of this coming assault. Well, General Meade decided that he did not want that division to lead the assault. Was it because there were African-American troops involved and that wouldn't look good one way or the other, whether they won or lost? Was it because he felt that, a different division would do the job better? Historians have debated back and forth what was Meade's true reasoning for telling Burnside to change the plan up. And nevertheless, the plan was changed. And rather than Burnside sitting back and choosing, you're the best for it, or your division is the best one to do this, they drew straws. Yes, all this wonderful training that the U.S. military puts you through when you have to face a tough decision, go ahead and draw straws, right? So, unfortunately, and perhaps Ledlie was just an unlucky guy. He's probably an unlucky guy in life. James Ledlie drew the short straw, and his division was then chosen to lead this very important assault on the position after the explosion was going to happen. So rather than running back to his command post and gathering his staff and talking to his regimental commanders and all those and prepping them for what was ahead, Ledlie really didn't do anything. He didn't prep them for what was ahead. They did not truly understand the plan. They didn't even know that this whole crater thing was going to happen, that this explosion was going to happen. All they knew is that they were going to be in the lead on the attack on the Confederate line. So again, he dithered a bit, and then when the time came early on the 30th of July to attack the crater, the munitions were let off in the tunnel. Huge explosion, 140 feet wide crater, very devastating. It worked like a charm, just like the engineers had hoped it would. Created a massive explosion, and then the earth sunk in, creating this crater. And Ledlie's division takes off right into this, massive hole created. And rather than skirt around the rim of the crater as the other division had trained to do, or at least had thought about doing, Ledlie's division kind of poured right down into the crater, more out of curiosity than anything else. They didn't know what to think or expect. They poured down into the crater. Then you have thousands of soldiers in this hole, and they couldn't fight their way out. Confederates, formed a counterattack, and it's just a terrible, terrible disaster for the Union forces, for the Army of the Potomac. General Ulysses S. Grant would bemoan the loss that day. It's just terribly devastating. Now, you may ask yourself, was James Ledlie duking it out there inside the crater? Oh no. When James Ledlie's division took off to conduct this assault without really knowing what they were getting into or what was going to happen, James Ledlie retreated to a bunker and got drunk during the whole thing. So, and I will quote the late, great Ed Barrs, longtime chief historian for the National Park Service, who wrote a book about the Eastern Front during the Petersburg campaign. He said, Ledlie retreated to a bunker where he caressed a bottle of rum. And I just always thought that was a wonderful explanation of what Ledlie was doing. And speaking of which, I thought you guys might be interested in our new state-supplied hand sanitizer. This is not a bottle of rum to be caressed by James Ledlie or anybody else. This is Catoctin Creek hand sanitizer produced by the Catoctin Creek Distilling Company in Purcellville, Virginia. So quite interesting. Do not drink. Use it on your hands. So there you have it. That is my top 10 worst U.S. generals of all time for those reasons. Now, I know you're asking, wait a second, there's some people that you didn't put on here that should be on here. I do have a dishonorable mention list. Yes, I do. I did put Douglas MacArthur on there, Dugout Doug, only because the controversy surrounding MacArthur, his escape from, Bataan and just the polarizing nature of Macarthur himself, his performance in Korea, and his inability to get along with President Truman during that, and his ultimate, being relieved for saying things about the president and all those things. So Macarthur, being such a controversial figure, certainly gets him dishonorable mention. Franz Sigel, Union commander, 1864, in the Shenandoah Valley. Just poor performance and inability to communicate. Not, had a heavy German accent. That was part of it, but frankly, just wasn't a very good commander at all. Very poor outcomes and performances on the battlefield. So not highly regarded. And of course, there's George Armstrong Custer, a general in the Civil War, to become a lieutenant colonel after the war, during the Indian Wars. That's how the Army worked back then. The reason he's not on the list is because he performed pretty well during the Civil War as a cavalry commander. Not the best, but certainly not the worst. Made a good name for himself. So he was riding high by the time he took off to fight Indians. And we all know what happened to George Armstrong Custer. Maybe the most famous defeat on the battlefield of U.S. forces, certainly during the Indian campaign. He was guilty of narcissism. He was guilty of not listening to his subordinates. He was guilty of overconfidence. He was guilty of ignoring certain aspects of intelligence. But he didn't necessarily dither. He didn't necessarily run. He didn't necessarily, maybe he would have run if he could have run. He was surrounded. But he didn't meet a lot of those criteria. So there you have it. Dishonorable mention. I'm sure there's some others out there. So what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and click on the chat here and see if we got some questions or concerns. Yes, I see one. I'm going to start. Why did U.S. generals perform so poorly in Afghanistan? Well, Roger, wow, let's go right for the jugular on that one. Hey, man, I got to keep my job sometimes. But certainly, and that's a different live stream program. Certainly, we could talk about military leadership and performance during the global war on terrorism, and particularly in Afghanistan. I would recommend not to do plugs. We don't make any money off of this, but Tom Ricks's book, The Generals, starts to get into his thoughts on more modern military leadership within the U.S. Army as it compares to World War II and other things, and how it's different, and how currently these days, generals perhaps aren't held to the highest standard, or they are given too many chances when they prove ineffective on the battlefield. So I'll leave it at that, as not to get myself in too much trouble. McKinley. Okay, thank you very much. Friedan, not Friedan. Okay, thank you. Carl, I must have had too many E's. Okay, too many E's in there. Thank you very much. Who are a few of the most successful generals? I probably will do a future presentation, a top 10 successful generals. That'll be a tough one. That'll be probably harder than identifying the worst, because the worst is kind of fun and you can have fun with it. But when you want to chalk up, who was really, tip of the iceberg at the very top, U.S. generals, that'll probably be hard, but it is worth a live stream. So I do have a personal favorite, but I'll hold on to that because I don't want to give up the ghost on that. I do have a personal favorite for that. All right. Kimberly. All right. Kimberly, thank you very much. Saying that Catoctin makes several fine products that are meant to be consumed. That is correct. This hand sanitizer is not to be consumed, but this is for a special purpose only during pandemic. So Catoctin Creek certainly has Kimberly's endorsement. So check it out. Purcellville, Virginia. Very good. All right. We have some other people. Let's see. Kimberly. We got some more chatting in here about Purcellville. Some fans of Purcellville. Oh, yes. Benedict Arnold. We have two questions. Wait a second. Where is Benedict Arnold? Two reasons I didn't put Benedict Arnold on here. One, because it's almost too easy, right? It's almost, I wanted to avoid the expected and have a little bit of unexpected. And I have always felt that Benedict Arnold performed at least good enough during the Saratoga campaign, showed some real heroism, some real bravery, was wounded, some toughness, that his performance at Saratoga doesn't negate his treasonous behavior later on, but it certainly buys him a little bit of, I don't know, credit, so that he doesn't end up on this list. I think I was more drawn to the cowards, to the drunkards, to those that ran. Maybe I should include traitor, being a world-class traitor and America's worst traitor in history on there as well. So plenty of people are expecting Benedict Arnold. They probably put him on there. All right. And then, Britt McCarley, good to see you on there. No, General Burnside will believe me. I considered Ambrose Burnside for a number of reasons. Fredericksburg, the Mud March, and then the draw straws thing. I mean, maybe Ledley was just a victim of circumstance. Maybe the true person that created that whole fiasco was Burnside, just having guys draw straws rather than making a good command decision. So that's right. Hey, it should roll uphill, shouldn't it? Good point that he was in command of Ledley. So it should roll uphill to Burnside. So maybe I'm giving the boss a pass a little bit, just like I blamed some of the other generals for doing. That's right. So Dale reminded that Benedict Arnold was one of the more successful generals during the war until he became a dirty and disgusting traitor to America. All right, Burnside. Okay. McClellan. There's a question on there. George McClellan, again, it was almost too easy. I thought long and hard about putting him on here. My biggest George McClellan, when I think about poor performance, George McClellan, a couple of things. His letter from Harrison's Landing with the self-promotion and the, none of this is my fault type stuff, and pushing the blame off on, the government. But also his performance at Antietam, where, again, leadership from the rear, while other commanders are duking it out, McClellan is back at the Pry House drinking lemonade and talking to reporters back there. So another wonderful case of leadership from the rear. And McClellan was certainly one of those guys that displayed some of that at times. And nevertheless, he does not make, Dale also mentions no mention of general officers from Vietnam. I thought about it. Again, Westmoreland seemed like a little bit too much of an easy answer. I wanted to include some names that perhaps people didn't know too much about. And now, for whatever reason, part of me feels like Westmoreland's had enough and didn't want to pile on. Or there's a couple other, U.S. generals from the Vietnam era that I felt like, let's not pile on. Edwin Walker, I did. I'll be honest. I don't know. I frankly don't know enough about Edwin Walker to at least put him on this list. I had to go with a number of leaders that I had at least known something about and researched just a bit. So with that, well, thank you very much. We're already past an hour. Hey, this was fun. I appreciate everybody tuning in and watching it. Again, this is not one of our live streams that we expect to impart a bunch of knowledge on. This was just a fun look at maybe the lesser celebrated aspects of American military history. But that's what I like about what we do here. We try and present American military history in different ways and get people interested. And if this was a little bit entertaining, a little bit interesting for you, we certainly did our job there. So again, will the slide deck be available? That's a good question. Morgan and Jim, anybody out there, if I want to make these slides available to somebody, can I do that? We'll wait for them to chime in and answer me. It shouldn't be a problem. I'll tell you what. Thank you, Karen. I appreciate it. Carl, thank you too. I tell you what, if anybody would like me to email these slides to them, okay, and the recording will be available tomorrow, and Morgan put her email address there in the chat. You can email her, and we can send you the slides. Slides aren't all that impressive, I have to admit. I'm still stuck in Windows 95 when it comes to PowerPoint and things like that. All right. And we can, and Dale, absolutely, you're going to get your slides. You can get as many slides as you want. No problem. Again, thank you all very much. This is fun. I appreciate it. And if we decide to do a top 10, we'll certainly put it out there and let you know. And hopefully you join us for that. So Sherry, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining our program. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us today for Generally Terrible, the worst U.S. generals of all time. And a very special thank you to Dr. Clay Mountcastle. On Wednesday, November 10th at 10:30 a.m., join us for our next live stream, Salute to Service, United States Marine Corps. Learn what it is like to serve as we commemorate the 246th birthday of this prestigious branch of the United States military. And on Thursday, November 11th at 11 a.m., join us in person in the Virginia War Memorial's Heilman Amphitheater for the Commonwealth of Virginia's Veterans Day ceremony. For those of you who cannot attend the event, the ceremony will be broadcast live on CBS 6. Visit our website for additional information. We will continue to commemorate Veterans Day with the screening of the film Saving Private Ryan at 7 p.m. on November 11th at the historic Byrd Theater on West Carey Street in Richmond. Tickets are available both online and at the door. Well, thank you to everyone who's been listening to our live stream broadcast, Learning from the Home Front. Previously recorded live stream programs are available at vawarmemorial.org/learn/resources and learn more about our upcoming programs at vawarmemorial.org/events. Everyone, have a wonderful day.